you know, we're not only talking about investing in women's economic opportunity initiatives, but really talking about how do we implement them in a way that has the biggest impact. And I think it's just a sign of how this discussion has evolved. And I want to thank the Center for Global Development for hosting the discussion and this important event, and the co-hosts, the World Bank, Plan International, and the United Nations Foundation for also being involved. We heard a fantastic panel earlier today on rigorous evaluation and research in this area. And this panel right now is really going to focus on the experience of practitioners and funders around measurement of women's economic empowerment programs. Before I introduce everyone, I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and talk a little bit about our journey at ExxonMobil. So for those of you who don't know, we launched our foundation initiative on women's empowerment 10 years ago. And it's really been kind of an iterative process in terms of how we've evolved this program. One of the first things we did was to decide that we were really going to focus narrowly on women's economic opportunities. And then a second aspect of that was really looking at how do you use technology as a catalyst. One thing that has been consistent through the entire 10 years is this idea that it's incredibly important to fund research. And that's because not only does it have an impact on our programs, but we felt like this was a way to advance the entire field. So we talked earlier about the roadmap, which really is, I think, one of the most important initiatives that we've supported. And that really came out of the question that our foundation president had, which is, if I had $1 to spend, what would be the most effective way of increasing women's incomes? And we couldn't answer that question. So we teamed up with Myra and Emily and the United Nations Foundation team to see if we could address this issue. What we've done since then is work with our partners to ensure that the programs that we're funding align with the research, so that we know what we're doing is proven to be effective. The next piece, though, was not just what are we doing, but how are we doing it? And that's where it really was a partnership with each of our grantees to ensure that they had the capacity to really implement proper measurement and evaluation. But the second piece was really asking ourselves, okay, we have a number of individual programs that we're implementing, but what is the impact of the entire foundation program? We invest annually over $12 million, and what's the impact of that $12 million in terms of increasing women's incomes? And it's especially challenging because we don't have one program that we implement consistently everywhere we operate. We have to tailor the program based on the community needs. So we fund urban and rural programs. We fund programs that are targeted at women farmers or women subsistent entrepreneurs, or women who run SMEs. So this was really, really challenging. And that's where I think the work that we've done with Myra and Jim and the UN Foundation on Measurement is so important, because it allows us for the first time to really measure the impact across the entire portfolio. First, by defining what is women's economic empowerment to us. We've defined it as an increase in income, productivity, and well-being. And then identifying indicators, outcome indicators, final and intermediate outcome indicators that can be measured in every single one of those programs. So hopefully a year from now, we'll be able to come back and talk about not just individual programs, but the impact of the entire foundation initiative. That's a year from now. But today, we have a fantastic panel of people who have had various kinds of diverse experiences with M&E. And so let me introduce them. Right here to my right, and I had to is Sydney Price, who is the Senior Vice President of Corporate Social Responsibility at Kate Spade. We have Henrietta Kolb, who is the head of the Gender Secretariat at the IFC. We have Priscilla Benson, who is the Senior Director for Program Services at TechnoServe, and Tessie St. Martin, who is the President and CEO of Plan International. So let me start with you, Sydney. Kate Spade has a very significant women's economic empowerment program, but it's not a traditional program. It's not a traditional community investment program. It's really tied to your business and to your bottom line. How did you decide to invest in this program, and did you look at research before you sort of made this significant move within your company?
Thank you. First of all, I just want to kind of explain the program that we're doing now. On Purpose is our trade initiative where we are teaching a group of 150 rural women in a marginalized community to be an independent and profitable supplier to our brands as well as the entire fashion industry. So these are not our employees, rather this is Rwandan women-owned for-profit social enterprise. 98% are women, and they're between the ages of 18 and 60. Prior to us coming up with our On Purpose model, which we really brought in-house, we had been working through a nonprofit called Women for Women International over 5 years in Bosnia, Rwanda, and Afghanistan. And what we realized, as wonderful as the relationship was, we really wanted to take it in-house because we were the business experts and everything had to have a business lens because we had to be profitable and whoever we'd be working with on the ground had to be profitable because it wasn't sustainable. There was also something that our employees were really yearning to have a heart connection with the actual artisans on the ground. So instead of working through someone, they wanted to work directly because we have so many in-house experts like from compliance, PD, and all of these things. So long story short, this group of Rwandans, we've been working with them for 2 years now in this little village called Masaro, produce products for us 12 months out of the year and every 3 months deliver to our stores globally. We believe that empowering women will transform their communities through trade. So it was critically important for us to align our M&E with our business goals. So first and foremost, we had to take this Rwandan vendor and we had to completely integrate it into our supply chain. So it had to become globally compliant, not only at the facility level, but trading across borders. And number two, they had to make beautiful and commercially viable product. They also had to do competitive pricing. They also had to deliver on time, and we also had to have full transparency of how they were paying their artisans for human rights as well as minimum wage standards and all of those things. So just to summarize, just to give you one example, M&E and baseline assessment was critical to us. So the first thing we learned was 94% of this population had survived the genocide, but also had never really been treated. So in regards to kind of intervention and setting up the program, we realized that health and their mental condition was having a direct impact on productivity, and productivity has a direct impact on cost of goods. So one of the first things we did is we hired a in-house nurse as well as a mental health counselor to make sure they address the needs of the population so that they could also make beautiful product.
Thank you. Well, that sounds like it's quite complicated because you're not just measuring one aspect. You're having to look at kind of this, the mental health or the health piece and the product piece. Did you develop an internal sort of capacity around M&E, or did you have to go outside of Kate Spade to develop your M&E process?
You know what? We had huge plans. We had a Rolls-Royce vision on a Fiat budget. We went out to the best M&E researchers and organizations out there. We just couldn't afford it. It was very much a startup within our organization, and every penny we were spending was getting put into our program. So what we did know is this was a very marginalized group of individuals. So what we did is we took the approach that we wanted to hire a local but also a culturally sensitive expert on the ground. So we teamed up with an all-women's business school called Aquila Institute based in Kigali. And then we also took all of kind of the best in-class surveys out within the world, and we really tailored it to our desired KPIs because we were very specific that we need an economic as well as social returns on our entire program. So just to give you one other example, we learned that 87% of our artisans, this was the first formal job they ever had. So you got to remember, this is between the ages of 18 and 60. So basically, we had to build everything for them hands-on. So teach them the code of ethics. How do you operate in a professional environment? How do you evaluate? How do you work in groups? How do you stay accountable? We also had to teach them vocational skills, management skills, and they had disposable income for the first time, so we also had to teach them financial literacy. Just to give you one example of how critical the M&E was.
Wow, that does sound pretty, extensive.
Yeah.
Henrietta, let me turn it over to you. The IFC has been working on creating these global financial centers, facilities for women with small, medium, and enterprises. How are you measuring the impact of those facilities? And I would imagine that this is especially challenging because you're having to channel a lot of this through local banks, so you don't have direct control.
Thanks, Noah, and thanks CDG for hosting us here. I should also say the IFC is part of the World Bank, so we're the private sector arm of the World Bank. To my World Bank colleagues in here, we have been married for about, I think, 7 months in terms of one gender team. And I think that's terrific for 2 reasons, because we know that gender constraints are not addressable by one sector alone. So I think actually utilizing what Marcus is learning in the Gender Innovation Lab or what Elena is learning at the IEG, and pulling that into actually making use of that in our intervention with the private sector. But I want to start with one quick example, which is making sure that we're speaking the language that actually is the private sector and that can be understood. So there's no point for us to have 60,000 impact evaluations if we can't actually crystallize those findings into a language that's being understood by our clients. And so I want to give one example as to why the roadmap for us was absolutely instrumental, because it was able to actually basically simplify very comprehensive background papers into a language that was understandable by practitioners at the IFC, but also by our clients, the private sector. And so what we did as a result, and I just thought I share that in terms of impact of these types of works, I got an email this morning from one of my team members from Gaza. She works there with the Bank of Palestine, and we've tweaked our entire offering around women entrepreneurship, training and development based off on the learning that came out of the economic roadmap, because we learned over time from our own practice as well as from the literature reviews that actually most of the impact on training and development was minimal, if not completely ineffective. And so looking actually into addressing what the challenges are around business development training, and then coming up with an offer that's probably not perfect, we will find out, but that actually helps us to actually fill some of those gaps that we hadn't thought of before. So just wanted to give a shout out as to how hugely useful this tool was, and to encourage all of those of you who do more impact evaluation to break it down into language that's being understood by people who work towards the bottom line. And so I think that's, to your point, I think is hugely important. So having said that as a sort of preamble, there's 2 things where we think that data is hugely important. One is if you look at the motivation around data gathering, which is advocacy. So I want to take you on a very quick journey, very quick in 2 minutes, but in around 2008, we started to talk more mainly to our banks, and we said, look, there's clearly a huge gap between men and women in terms of accessing all kinds of financial services. So as the World Bank Group, our goal is not necessarily make our banks only more profitable, but it's also to close that gap in terms of access to assets. So in the beginning, obviously people are like, well, yes, but women are not so profitable because otherwise the market would have closed that gap. And a huge amount of skepticism comes at you, and they're like, well, they've got smaller enterprises and they're not able to repay their loan and so on and so forth. So the first part of our data undertaking is really digging into, and that's detective work, into quantifying what is the market opportunity for certain businesses. And I won't go into what we have done with McKinsey in kind of quantifying the market size that exists around SME, which is staggering, and it very much shows that actually financial inclusion is not charity, it is absolute business opportunities. But I want to give you a very quick example as to what we're currently doing. So we looked at, said, okay, well, women need clearly loans, women need saving products. I think that was another understanding that came out clearly from the roadmap.
But beyond that, what about insurance? Insurance is pushing out into emerging markets, in particular big multinationals, like crazy, but no one knows. What do women want and need from insurance products? How many women are actually policyholders? And what the market size is for insurers by 2030. So we started off finding out what's the market size that insurers should actually consider in terms of the consumer power that women have in emerging markets as they're rising in their assets. And so that report will come out. I won't do a sneak preview on the 16th of September, but it will speak to the industry and say, hang on a minute, guys, mostly guys in the insurance industry, hang on a minute, guys, you're actually overlooking a business opportunity. And then, of course, the second step is, well, okay, how do you then cater for what women want and need? And that brings me to the facility where we are working. It's called the Banking on Women program, which the Women Entrepreneurship Facility is part of, where we started to go to banks in particular and said, look, you could actually really do a lot more around your loan portfolio when it comes to women-owned enterprises. And most banks start off in saying, well, what do you mean? We have no sign on the door, women are not allowed. Of course they are allowed, of course they can come in. And so to give one quick example, a bank in Lebanon, we said, well, why don't you just start ask the question as to how many of your SME loans are going to women-owned enterprises and men? And then you start, well, what is a women-owned enterprise, right? And then we can say, well, we have an IFC definition and we're broadening that out to the Global Banking Alliance and talk to IDB about that. But each bank in emerging markets has its own definition if they have one. And then you need to find out, once you've agreed what the definition is, where the loan portfolio sits. And what we saw in Lebanon was, in one particular bank, women-owned enterprises, the loans were only 12%. But we looked at the market and we saw, okay, actually registered formal enterprises in women's names are actually much higher. So we could show the bank, look, you're actually not focusing on a potential custom element. So when we then design interventions with them, it's obviously an investment part to that, where we put on a credit line that then goes to women-owned enterprises. But almost more importantly in some of these aspects is where we then have an advisory technical component to the bank and tell the bank, well, or work with the bank to say, okay, what type of products do you just need to tweak those? Or you need to market them differently, or you need to create innovative repayment structures so that, for example, when I'm on maternity leave, I can sit out 3 months of repayment, which we've just done in the Philippines. So you then look at the strategy and the market competitors, and you take all of that into consideration, and then you come up with the measurement as to what makes sense. And that does not yet touch the end beneficiary, right? And so I think this morning we heard a lot about what the end beneficiary needs in terms of economics, in terms of social empowerment, in terms of political empowerment. And we sort of work very much with our clients in terms of saying, well, has this product been taken up? Is it sustainable? Is it actually being bought and intended to do what it, is it doing what it was intended to do? So we are sort of going around that field and making sure that our clients are commercially getting out what they were hoping to get out of. But then in the next step, we then go to the end beneficiaries and ask them questions as to what's the difference. And there, I think we collectively, I think as the MDBs, the multilateral development financing institutions and banks, we have more work to do because as soon as you go into operations, the investment officer or the other officers who are actually in the day-to-day business, they're like, Henrietta, you have no idea. I've already to ask my clients about 180 questions. You want me to ask 300 more? That's just not possible. And why would I ask those questions if I can't make a business case out of it? So I'm just being very realistic as to some of the challenges you need to overcome as well.
Yeah, and it goes back to one of the 6 principles, which is keep it short.
Keep it simple.
And keep it simple.
Yeah.
I have a couple of follow-up questions, but we don't have a lot of time, so I'll ask Priscilla the next question, then I'll come back to you, Henrietta. So, Priscilla, TechnoServe has an incredibly ambitious target to include at least 35% women in all of your programs. Are you, and how are you, tracking the success of this program and women's economic empowerment? And how do you ensure the programs are having equal impact both on the female recipients, or the male recipients and female recipients?
Sure, great question. So TechnoServe works with enterprising women and men in 30 countries in Central and South America, Africa, and India to build competitive farms, businesses, and industries. And I assume that I'm preaching to the choir and don't need to go into details about why reaching women is important. So if we cut that step, we at TechnoServe believe that success is ensuring both the participation of and the benefit to women of TechnoServe's interventions. So when we started crafting our strategic plan for 2013 to 2017, we decided that we wanted to set for ourselves this, what we thought at the time was an ambitious target of reaching 35% women. And when we talk about reach, we're not talking about a woman who makes a cameo appearance for 5 minutes in a training. We're talking about farmers who have adopted new agronomic or business practices. We're talking about small and growing businesses that have seen an increase in revenue, and we're talking about newly created jobs. So in 2012, our reach number was 19%. So that was our baseline. We thought, okay, 35%, we have 5 years. It's going to be tough, but we're going to roll up our sleeves and we're going to do it. What we found, driven by this intention and by what we're learning about how to effectively engage women, that in 2014, in fact, we reached 36% women for a total of about 115,000 women. So we're very proud of that. But what does it tell us? It tells us that reaching women is actually easier than you might think if you really put your mind to doing it and fixing the intention. But when you talk about reach in terms of participation, that's actually the easier part. The more difficult part is how do you ensure that women are actually benefiting? We understand that there are many people who assume that any incremental money within a household is considered to make everyone in the household better off. But that just is not true. It assumes that everyone within the household has the same spending priorities. From our own research, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation funded coffee initiative in East Africa has shown that in 94% of households, spouses did not actually share the same spending priorities. That's a pretty significant gap. That's virtually every household where the man and the woman think differently about how money ought to be spent. So there's a growing body of evidence, and again, I'm probably preaching to the choir. You probably have your own favorite pet statistic. But this increasing body of evidence that shows that incremental money in the hands of a woman is more likely to further development objectives than incremental money in the hands of a man. That pet statistic for me would be from an FAO study in Cote d'Ivoire that showed that $10 of incremental money to a woman is equal to $110 worth of incremental money in the hands of a man when it comes to outcomes for children's health and nutrition. That's pretty profound. So it's not just about participating, ensuring that women participate, but how are women really benefiting? The way that we have typically thought about households in research has actually reinforced some pretty negative gender norms. We talk about a household being either a male-headed household or a female-headed household, and even in that language, we are reinforcing the idea that there is some member of the household who is more important than every other member of the household. And I'd just like to take a second and acknowledge USAID for starting to take some leadership in this area and acknowledging that this really isn't the best way to think about a household. So at TechnoServe, we believe that every member of the household is important, and we acknowledge that everyone in the household, at least the adults and children of a certain age, are contributing to that economic unit that is the household. So we want to understand it's not about if there is more money coming into the household, that's a first step, but it's also who has decision-making authority over the resources of the household, including any incremental money that's coming in the form of revenue or wages. This is challenging. If I may state the obvious, in a first instance, it's challenging because TechnoServe staff sometimes feel uncomfortable with this. It can feel a bit confrontational, like we're taking on social norms. We don't self-identify as an organization as one that's all about changing social norms. But what we found is that this, in fact, can be a bit easier than it may on the surface appear through the value of transparency and having various members of the household really understand what's happening financially. So in our work in the agricultural sector, we often work with and through farmer business groups. And what has become a common practice for TechnoServe is that we register each and every farming member of that household in the farmer business group. And that when payments are made to that household, it's done in a transparent way so that both the man and the woman, or women, depending on the constitution of the household, know how much money is being paid to the household. We found, again, in our coffee initiative in East Africa, that 40% of women didn't know how much money was being paid to their household in coffee earnings, and they tended to underestimate the value by 50%. So pretty staggering information asymmetry. Interestingly enough, what we found is that merely by having all adult members of the household know how much money was coming into the household, it changed spending patterns. So I don't know if it is some sort of peer pressure. The man knowing that the woman knows somehow changes what happens within the household. We certainly encourage dialogue within the members of the family to talk about spending and spending priorities. But I guess my message would be one of optimism, that it on the surface seems challenging, but when you set your mind to it, it doesn't have to be as hard.
It's interesting how something as simple as just transparency can have such a huge impact, but I can imagine that there are huge challenges in terms of the empowerment piece, because I would think that your expertise is really around increasing productivity, growing markets, and now all of a sudden you're dealing with a whole other set of issues, which are the empowerment piece, and really sort of integrating that into your programs is I would imagine not easy, but that's a good first start, just transparency. Tessie, let me move to you and the work that you're doing at Plan International. How do you define success for your programs that are aimed at improving women's economic empowerment? And I'm thinking of the program like the Global Women in Management program that isn't necessarily working with the direct beneficiaries, but working through women who are leaders and really developing their capacity.
All right, yeah, so let me, for the benefit of everybody else, talk a little bit about that program and describe it a little bit, and then get to your seemingly very simple question, but it's not. So the Global Women in Management program, which actually has been supported by ExxonMobil since 2005, it actually is a program that has been in one way or another been functioning since 1978, and it was designed by CETPA, the Center for Development Population Activities, which merged with Plan in 2012. And so that's how we came to the program. And you might say, well, if you know anything about Plan, we're a child and youth, focused organization. What does that have to do with women's empowerment? But to the point of my colleague here, we can't think of a better investment in terms of ensuring that children are taken care of, go to school, and are nourished than to invest in women, which is why, sort of for us, sort of the merger made so much sense, and supporting this program is so much at the core of what Plan does. So the idea, to your point, of the program is to so we're not investing in the in the final beneficiaries, right? We're investing in women who are running organizations that are providing some sort of service to women, and that are very much related to economic empowerment of women in a broad range of communities in many countries around the world. So the theory of change of the Global Women in Management program is as follows: that we build the capacity and leadership of women who come back to their organizations with not just more knowledge about how to run a better organization, but more self-confidence. I'll come back to that. That makes them more able leaders. That then translates into better run organizations that are providing better quality programs. That then turns into benefits for for the communities and the women that are being served by these organizations. So you follow all of that. You're going, well, to go back to your question of success, what are we characterizing as success? You can look at it in three parts, right? So what's happening with the women that went through the program? What's happening to the organization where these women went back to? And then what's happening to the beneficiaries of these organizations? So we've been, for many years, we do invest in monitoring and evaluation. But that monitoring and evaluation had primarily to do with, so did the women learn, did they retain, and did they apply, right? But with the support of the ExxonMobil Foundation, one of the things that we wanted to do is to get deeper into this question of what's the impact that we're having. And the way that we looked at the impact or sort of the success of the program, to the extent that there was success, was primarily through a survey of the women that participated in the program. And we basically tried to survey the universe of women that had been supported since 2005. We couldn't get to all of them because we didn't have working email addresses. So we got to 2/3 of those, and then of that about 58% responded. Which, sort of, I think that's a fairly, good sample, but, are there any biases implicit in terms of who could be reached or not by email, and then, who was motivated enough to respond? So these are things that we can get into, but I really don't want to here. And so we relied primarily on those surveys, on focus groups. We also interviewed the supervisors of the women that were coming back to get a more rounded thing, but there were some things that were missing from the evaluation, which I can come back to. So what did we find? In terms of the women themselves, and remember, this is mostly self-reported, and it's what the supervisors are also saying that they observed. So they, obviously they learned a lot, and they felt that they learned a lot, but what really mattered, what came out of sort of the surveys, was the fact that they were much more self-confident. I love this part. It says they were much more relaxed as managers. And so therefore they felt that they were much more effective. But think about it. Actually, it's not trivial, right? I mean, just think back to the first time you were a manager. I mean, a lot of the problems with managers is that they're so insecure that they end up not being particularly good. And people are laughing, oh, yeah, I know somebody like that. But anyway, and so they were much more relaxed. They were self-confident. So it was, there was a palpable and measurable change in attitude. What we didn't do, which we were talking about doing, and certainly the panel earlier this morning, is there was no sort of standardized psychometric measure that we did. So again, we're relying on self-reporting. They all attributed that change in confidence and that ability to lead and to make better decisions and so on. They all not all of them, 95% attributed that to the program. And it's remarkable because even 10 years after they went through the program, they're still attributing it to the program. Again, we don't have independent verification of that, but it tells us that we were doing something right. And it turns out that was what was most valuable for the women, even though there are many different, and this is to, I think, your earlier comment. So we provided a lot of technical training in running a business, in management, and so on. But what was really valuable was the leadership training. In terms of how do I work better as a group? How do I make decisions? That, which is, again, more perhaps squishy and softer, but that was what was felt to be truly valuable. Then, so next sort of layer would be, okay, so then what happened to the organizations of the women once they came back? Well, so it turns out that by their account, by their supervisor's account, and other people that were sort of involved, they were organizations that were much more likely to make some changes, including investing in M&E, improving their community outreach and community engagement. There were a variety of good things and internal changes that were seen to be made in the organization, and that translated into organizations being more people seeing the quality of their programming going up, and to a certain extent, the proof is in the pudding. They were better able to attract funding, and they were better able to attract a broader range of donors to those organizations. So now the third question is, so what happened to the beneficiaries? Given the methodology that was used, what we have is some interesting anecdotal information, but not a lot of hard data in terms of, well, did this really make a difference and how to the communities? So I think that's sort of a story that remains to be done and to be told.
Yeah, No, and that's one of the challenges around those sort of indirect programs. How do you capture that impact, the sort of the secondary impact? We have about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to turn it. I have a number of questions that I'd like to ask, but I'm going to turn it over to the audience for questions. So, if you have a question, please raise your hand. No questions?
They're all hungry.
Hi, sorry. I'm Andrea Lozano from Save the Children, and just a very practitioner question. A frequent concern that we have is thinking about the time frame, and especially when you're looking at indicators that measure income, business income. I just wanted to put the question out there of what, from your experience, what do you think is a reasonable time frame to expect sort of training interventions to lead to an economic improvement? So, and how do you relate that to the wider economic situation in the region or in the village or in the country even?
Sounds like a simple question, but maybe not so simple. Priscilla, do you want to answer that question?
Sure, yeah, no, it's an excellent question. We found in our own experience that when we're working with businesses, we tend to be promoting the adoption of a set of business practices that lead to the longer-term sustainability of the business, but don't necessarily reflect any kind of short-term revenue gains. I would say a couple of years.
Yeah.
It's not within a year. That I can tell you with great certainty.
Does anybody else want to add to that?
Maybe just very briefly, and that's actually a study that came out of the bank, but what was interesting was there was recently an evaluation in India around microenterprise and financial education, and what seemed to make a huge difference in terms of impact 3 months and 6 months after. I think Marcus can probably correct it. I think it's 3 months and 6 months, but was that whether the women who were trained or educated around financial literacy were able to bring a friend. And those women who brought along a friend actually showed and demonstrated a lot more impact, possibly because she was setting goals in that training and someone else reminded her afterwards as to what those goals were, but also support and encouragement. And so really fascinating how at minimal cost you can actually expand, it seems to be, I mean, it was a relatively small scale study, seems to be in terms of impact, you know, how much business impact you were able to generate. Now, it hadn't been measured long term, so I think it would be interesting to see whether that's still valid in a year time, but otherwise I'd agree. I think in my previous role with the Shri Blair Foundation for Women, we usually looked at 12 months and then 24 months and then 36 months in terms of time frame, but mainly not so much because we wouldn't want to do 5 years or 10 years, but mainly because around funding cycles, and funding cycles being typically 3 years, and then you need to tell the good story to your funder so you get the money rolling again. And so I think that's another thing that's, you know, hugely flawed, and where I find the work at IFC quite fascinating is the accountability structures and what type of data are we also feeding back to our clients and then to our end beneficiaries, because we're always good in extracting data, but we're obviously, I think, sometimes not really set out well and haven't thought out really carefully what actually would women want to know that we're asking all these questions. I mean, would they want to learn more about, should they work in networks, should they work in isolations? I mean, all these questions that we are so hungry for and then use upwards and sidewards, I mean, we're not really feeding them back downwards. And I think sometimes, and that's maybe just one more reflection, I think we're always asking for more data, but the capabilities in organizations to even utilize effectively the data that we already have and tell a coherent story is rather limited. And I think sometimes we need to be quite humble and self-critical to say, in some instances, we actually have a lot of data. So if we were taking the time in our busy lives to actually read it carefully and interpret it carefully and then explain it in a language that's meaningful, we would already have moved, I think, mountains in terms of making progress in women's economic empowerment.
That's an excellent point.
Can I just add one thing? Because I think one of the interesting things about the GWIM program is not just, so the training is provided in over a 3 to 4 week period, and it's pretty intense. But one of the more interesting things about the program that I think, again, we're learning in terms of how to refine it is a coaching process that takes place over a 12-month period. And that's actually very valuable. And what it also tells me is that it's not just, well, here's what I do with it, that is also part of this, you know, sort of capacity and leadership building.
Yeah, the kind of the reinforcing.
Yeah.
That's a great point. All right, maybe what I'll do is just take 2 questions quickly, and hopefully these are 3 questions, I'm sorry, quickly, and then we'll hopefully answer them pretty quickly. Go ahead.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Sheila Scott from IREX, where I work in the Center for Collaborative Technology and also on the Gender Community of Practice. So I have a question for you about measuring unintended consequences. I think there are 2 points in the roadmap that we all probably understand actually represent some tension here. So the one is to be short and sweet and have focus on numeric indicators, and the other is the complexity of the problems and the solutions to increase women's economic empowerment. And in particular, in our work at IREX, I've seen this irony, that as women are able to take advantage of community engagement opportunities or income-generating activities, someone within that household unit often has to pick up the slack for their unpaid labor. And ironically, that's often their daughters. So I'm wondering if in your experience you have tried to measure that, or if anyone knows of any research that has done that well, so that we can all try to integrate that into our own work so that we're not inadvertently causing problems for the next generation. Thank you.
Great question.
Wow.
In the E3 Bureau, for those of you who know us. A question also about numbers. What this has been to me is a case study confirming what the ExxonMobil Foundation roadmap had to say, which is bundled activities, doing more things has a greater impact. You have pointed out coaching, mentoring, that training by itself, maybe a 0, maybe just a little bit, but not a big impact. And everything you've mentioned that helps to make things work and have an impact has a cost. So it's expensive to do things that have an impact. We can do, spend hundreds of thousands to reach thousands of people with almost no impact, or we can send the same money to reach very few people with a lot more impact. Can you talk some about how you balance this, especially with funders? And I will throw out one funder who puts almost well, let's just say a really high emphasis on scalability. Got to be big, really big. How many numbers can you get us? You're talking about something that we don't have the money to scale. Or to go to the scale we're talking about, it's by knocking off things that make the whole system work. How do you balance that pressure? And I'm sure even at Kate Spade, well, you're only working with 153 people. How come we can't have a bigger impact? How do you deal with this? What do you do? And or maybe the real question is, what's your message to us so that we work together to achieve impact and not numbers?
It's another great question. All right, we'll take the last question at the back of the room.
Malini Patel, Vital Voices. This is for Sydney at Kate Spade. I'd love to hear your experience in trying to bring rural artisans into the supply chain, because I think that's a huge area for many of the corporates in the space. There are lots of challenges that we know of, what you've really learned, the biggest opportunities and the biggest challenges, and if you plan to expand, what is that time frame for you?
Why don't you go? Yeah, start that one. Just clarification, when you say rural artisans, are you talking about the ones we're working with, or just all the rural artisans in the world? Okay. I don't know if I can answer the big question.
Good clarification.
So first and foremost, if you went to this village, even though we have invested a lot of money into it, there is not one thing that says Kate Spade anywhere. We have completely not branded this at all. We have completely propped them up as a for-profit social enterprise. So they, all 170 women, are equal owners of this business. We have created a team on the ground to be there every single day. Back to the question of how long it takes. I truly believe it takes 3 years at a minimum. I have seen so much more damage done than good, unless you really do the long haul. And then in regards to your question, you have to measure them equally. We believe $1 invested gives you two benefits, not only the economic benefit, but the social benefit. In Rwanda alone, there's over 500 artisanal cooperatives. They're all making the exact same thing, baskets using the exact same materials. We believe the only way to unlock this nut is to give them access to a global market and to give them designs and make things that they're not competing with everyone else in the country. And they also have to be fashion forward and viable, because you want the customer to buy one every single month. If you make a piece basket, as beautiful it is, you might need one for your entire life, versus if it's this new shade of blue or this new shade of purple, the fashion customer wants to buy it all the time. So,
great response. So I wonder if the three of you want to tackle the issue of unintended consequences and scale.
Sure, I can
Easy.
jump in. Yeah, the unintended consequences question is one that we have been quite mindful of, specifically with respect to gender-based violence, to ensure that we're not setting a woman up for a situation where her husband is uncomfortable with what's happening. And again, it gets back to transparency. It's working with men, helping them to understand the interventions, what we're trying to do. You have to think about women in their larger context and not just as kind of an individual floating in space. The specific question about whether or not it's making life harder for their daughters is definitely something that I would love for us to think about more. So thank you for bringing it up. The depth versus breadth question, we're in the process right now. We're halfway through our strategic plan period, and one of the key learnings from the first 2.5 years is we set one of our impact targets in terms of reach and the other in terms of financial benefit. But the two weren't linked, and now we're trying to figure out different ways to link those, because we are interested in transformative change. And obviously, if you are reaching 600,000 people, but each one of them is seeing an additional $1 a year, that's not really transformative change. So we are testing different ideas right now around thresholds. So for different beneficiary types, we would want to see a minimum of X. Or alternatively, for different beneficiary types in different countries, see an increase of 20%, 30%, what have you. So we're absolutely right now wrestling with the same challenge that you've identified. And I'm happy to hear that someone from USAID is wrestling with this as well, because there is a lot of pressure to scale, and you absolutely lose depth when you focus on breadth. For sure, there's a big trade-off there.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead, either one of you. I'll let both of you.
Well, just one quick thing. Because, well, in fact, I love going after you because you already said most of it. But one thing, though, Wade, on the question of, the whole sort of scale thing just kind of bothers me. One of the, well, because here's the deal, right? And this comes from, I'm sure many of you have read, like what Ben Ramalingam has written, in terms of development being, an emergent property of a complex adaptive system, which really means, right, that at the end of the day, it's not about finding the silver bullet and just producing it massively and making sure, but it's really about iteration, right, which is really about learning and then figuring out what you've learned, integrate it, and iterate again, and then learn. And I think that's a better way of thinking about it, particularly for the issues that we're talking about here, in my opinion.
Henrietta, did you want to add to that?
I saw the sign, so I get very scared.
No, go ahead. We'll go over 30 seconds. 30 seconds.
Okay. So we work on 5-dimensional gender, so employment, entrepreneurship, supplier, consumers, and stakeholders and leaders. And so, for example, on employment, we clearly work not on scale, but on quality employment. So we work with companies as to how can improve quality employment for women, not just ticking how many women come through the door. When we work on consumers and actually working with banks and insurance companies and others, where we really clearly see there's an underserved segment that are women, there obviously we have to go for scale, because naturally that's where the commercial opportunity is in scale. And so there we look, but not only to the consumer end, but also, for example, where are women as agents and brokers, right? Because we know that some of that scale can actually be only achieved if we include women into becoming agents and brokers in the insurance industry or mobile money agents, which are predominantly men-dominated and so on and so forth. So I think that's where we would come down with scale vis-a-vis the sort of the quality and not the numbers ticking.
Yeah, and from our perspective, I don't think they're necessarily mutually exclusive. Right. You can have programs that really go into depth, but then you can also have programs that are looking at scale, and they can actually be quite complementary. So, all right, with that, I will say thank you to all of you and say thank you to our panelists for a great discussion.